The unlikely target. The sunlight poured into the small room, casting a warm golden hue on the hardwood floors of the Carter family home. Maya and Mia Carter had been inseparable for as long as they could remember. Identical twins, they were the perfect balance of energy and calm, each complementing the other in a way that made them unstoppable. They were used to being the center of attention wherever they went. Top students, gifted athletes, and well-loved members of their community, their futures were already painted in bold, bright strokes. But that morning, something felt different. "Can you believe we have the whole day off?" Maya asked, her voice soft but excited as she slipped on her jacket. No SAT prep, no track meets. Just us, no schedule, no pressure. Mia grinned, the energy from her sister always rubbing off on her. Just us, and some beautiful dresses waiting to be tried on. She added, her voice bubbling with excitement. "We're going to look fabulous." The twins shared a glance, their hearts light and carefree, as they set off for Charleston's most prestigious shopping district. The rhythmic beat of their footsteps matched in perfect sync, like a song they'd been rehearsing their entire lives. They crossed the old historic streets of their neighborhood, dressed in casual chic, a blend of comfort and confidence that made them look like they belonged in the pages of a fashion magazine. At the corner of the street, the gleaming glass doors of Morton's, the city's upscale department store, beckoned. The store's sleek, polished windows displayed the finest luxury brands, and inside, a serene atmosphere awaited them. Soft music played in the background, mingling with the scent of high-end perfumes. It was a shopper's paradise. Maya's eyes sparkled as she held open the door for her sister. "Okay, let's be smart about this," she said, her voice filled with the quiet determination that always accompanied her. "We want to look perfect for that gala in 2 weeks." Mia rolled her eyes playfully, already heading toward a rack of shimmering dresses. "When are we not perfect?" she teased, holding up a sparkling blue dress that seemed to glow under the lights. They walked through the racks of formal wear, trying on dress after dress, laughing and teasing each other about their choices. Maya found a burgundy number that made her feel like she was about to take over the world, while Mia picked out a radiant emerald gown, her favorite color, that she knew would make her feel vibrant. Despite their excitement, there was a strange tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to shift. The store, which had seemed like a peaceful haven just moments ago, now felt colder. More people started trickling in, and the chatter grew louder. The calmness that had defined their shopping experience began to evaporate. It was when they were walking toward the checkout counter that it happened. A tall security guard, his face unreadable, stepped directly in front of them, blocking their path. "Excuse me, ladies," he said in a tone that was anything but polite. His arms were crossed over his chest, his eyes scanning the dresses they were carrying as if they were guilty of something they hadn't done. "I need you to come with me." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, trying to remain calm. "We have reason to believe you've been shoplifting," the guard stated flatly, not even sparing a glance at their receipts, which they immediately pulled out and handed over in confusion. Mia's voice cracked with disbelief. "What? That's ridiculous. We paid for these. Look, here's the receipt." The guard barely looked at the slips of paper. "Doesn't prove anything," he replied coldly, stepping in front of them and guiding them toward the back office. Maya felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. They had done nothing wrong. Why was this happening? Her mind raced as they passed racks of clothes and luxurious displays. Was this really happening? As the twins were escorted into a small, windowless back room, their sense of unease grew stronger. The store manager, a man with perfectly styled hair and a suit that screamed privilege, appeared moments later. He looked them over with a sharp gaze, barely acknowledging their presence. "Now let's get this straight," the manager said, his voice oozing with disdain. "We have a situation here, and I'm afraid you two don't belong in a store like this." Mia opened her mouth, but no words came out. The insult hit them both like a slap across the face. They had done everything right, been nothing but respectful and polite, never breaking a rule. But here they were being treated like criminals. "What do you mean by that?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but trembling with anger. "This is a high-end establishment," the manager continued, ignoring her question. "We've had issues with people like you before. I'm calling the police." The coldness in the air thickened. Maya could feel her heartbeat in her ears as the manager picked up the phone and dialed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was a blatant attack on them, on their very identity. They were targeted not because of their actions, but because of who they were. "This isn't happening," Maya whispered to her sister, clutching her hand. But Mia's face was tight with a mixture of confusion and anger. The police arrived, and their world collapsed into chaos. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they were questioned in a way that made them feel like criminals, like they didn't belong. They were interrogated, their every word doubted. The weight of their skin felt like a burden. The guard, the manager, the officers, no one believed them. And that was when it hit them. It didn't matter how much they'd excelled, how hard they'd worked to prove themselves. To some, they would always be just black girls. It wasn't until hours later, sitting in the cold, sterile courthouse, that they realized just how deep this bias ran. They had walked into that courtroom expecting justice, expecting fairness. What they received instead was humiliation. The judge, his voice dripping with contempt, mocked their aspirations. He made a spectacle out of their struggle. But then, something shifted. As Judge Albright poured a glass of wine over their heads in an act of deliberate cruelty, something inside them broke, and something new began to form. Mia reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of her phone. She glanced at her sister, their eyes meeting with an unspoken understanding. There was someone they could call. They pulled out their phones, dialed the number they knew would change everything. And the world around them would never be the same. This opening sets the tone for the dramatic shift that occurs when the twins call their father, the U.S. Attorney General. It starts with a light and carefree atmosphere, then descends into a tense, emotionally charged situation. As the story progresses, it will explore the power dynamics, resilience, and eventual triumph of the twins against a corrupt system. The breaking point. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, as though every breath taken was laden with the weight of an unspoken truth. Maya and Mia sat rigidly, their bodies stiff with the effort to keep calm. They could feel the stares of those around them, some sympathetic, others judgmental, and some downright cruel. The whispers that floated around them like smoke were louder now, sharper as they took their seats on the worn wooden bench. The courtroom, a place that should have been a sanctuary of justice, felt cold and unfamiliar. The twin sisters exchanged a glance, both recognizing the sinking feeling in their stomachs. This wasn't just about their innocent mistake anymore. It was about something far darker, something more insidious. They had come to the court expecting a fair trial, expecting the truth to be seen and heard. But they weren't prepared for the humiliating reality that awaited them. Judge Warren Albright, sitting high on his bench, scanned the room through the rim of his thick glasses, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the twins. His lips curled into a smug, cynical smile, as though already anticipating the power he would wield over them. The entire atmosphere of the courtroom seemed to bend under his oppressive presence. Well, Judge Albright drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "What do we have here?" His eyes flicked between Maya and Mia, his words calculated, his gaze cutting. "I suppose it's time to have the usual conversation, isn't it?" Maya and Mia stiffened, both of them instinctively drawing closer to one another. Their fingers entwined tightly, a silent promise that they would stand strong together. "We weren't shoplifting, Your Honor," Maya began, trying to keep her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside her. "We paid for everything. We have the receipts." Mia's voice trembled, but she fought to control it. "Please, we just came here to buy some dresses." Judge Albright didn't let them finish. "I didn't ask for your defense," he interrupted sharply, holding up his hand as though dismissing them before they could even speak. His gaze moved over them, lingering on their clothes, their faces, as if they were nothing more than objects to be dissected. "What I'm interested in," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone, "is why two well-off girls from families like yours find themselves caught up in shoplifting accusations in the first place. Trying to live beyond your means, perhaps." He leaned forward in his chair, looking down at them, with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Maya's blood ran cold. "Your Honor," she tried again, her voice firmer, "we've done nothing wrong. We've never even had a detention in our entire lives. You can check the security cameras. You'll see we didn't take anything." Albright only laughed, the sound cruel and mocking. "Do you think I haven't heard that same line 1,000 times before? We're innocent, we've worked hard, we're good kids, and yet here you are. I have to admit, it's almost charming how the privileged ones always think the rules don't apply to them." Mia's eyes burned with anger, her fists clenched at her sides, but Maya put a hand on her arm, urging her to stay calm. She had learned long ago that anger only fueled the flames of injustice. They had to remain composed, no matter how deeply their hearts ached with humiliation. "You don't understand." Mia's voice cut through the thick tension. "This isn't about us being privileged. It's about a mistake, a misunderstanding. We're not criminals, and we didn't do anything wrong." The judge's face twisted into something darker. "You're right, Mia," he sneered. "This isn't about you being privileged. It's about you thinking you can walk into my courtroom and demand special treatment. But let me be clear, no one is above the law. Not even good girls like you." Maya felt the sting of his words, but she refused to let him see her pain. She straightened her back and met his gaze. "Please, just look at the evidence. We have receipts." Judge Albright cut her off again, his voice thunderous. "Enough." His gavel slammed down with an echo that sent shivers down both girls' spines. "The law isn't here for you to manipulate." He spat, each word a bitter declaration. "The law is here to remind you that there are consequences for people like you who think they can play games with the system." The words struck harder than they expected. It was as if they were invisible in this room, their cries for justice falling on deaf ears. The judge wasn't interested in truth. He wasn't interested in facts. He had already made up his mind. They were guilty in his eyes, not because of any wrongdoing on their part, but because of who they were. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder, like an electric current of judgment. Maya felt the heat of everyone's eyes on her, on them. She clenched her fists beneath the table, her heart pounding in her chest. Mia was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath. "We're not criminals," she declared, her words sharp and resolute. "We didn't steal anything, and we don't deserve this. No one should be treated like this because of their skin color." The courtroom froze. The judge's eyes narrowed, his smirk faltering for just a moment before he regained his composure. He lifted his glass of red wine, swirling it slowly, savoring his power. And that was when it happened, the moment everything changed. Maya's hand moved to her pocket, her fingers brushing the familiar, smooth surface of her phone. She glanced at Mia, their silent communication passing between them in an instant. Without saying a word, they both reached for their phones and pulled them out. The room seemed to hold its breath. Maya's fingers flew over the screen, dialing a number that would change everything. The moment she pressed call, the tension in the courtroom shifted. The loud hum of whispered conversations died down, and the silence that followed was profound. Mia lifted her chin. Her voice, though quiet, rang clear through the courtroom. "Would you like to explain this to our father?" she asked, her tone unwavering as she held up her phone for everyone to see. The name on the screen was simple, but powerful. U.S. Attorney General Richard Carter. Judge Albright's smug expression faltered. His hand, still holding his wine glass, trembled. The room, once filled with whispers and judgment, was now suffocating under the weight of the revelation. For a moment, Albright didn't speak. His eyes darted between the twins and the phone screen, and his lips parted as if trying to formulate a response. But there was none. "What is this?" The judge sneered, his tone now laced with uncertainty. "Who is your father?" Maya raised the phone higher, making sure the entire room could see the contact name clearly. "He's the U.S. Attorney General, and I think he'll be very interested in hearing about what's been happening here today." A chill ran through the courtroom. The air seemed to crackle with an energy that hadn't been there before. The judge's bravado evaporated, replaced by something Maya hadn't expected: fear. A ripple ran through the room, whispers now filling the air in frantic murmurs. The judge's face paled, and his grip on the glass tightened. He looked as though he wanted to shrink, to vanish from the room entirely. The power dynamics in the room had shifted. The twins, drenched in humiliation just moments before, now stood tall. Their posture had changed, no longer shrinking under the weight of judgment, but radiating strength, defiance, and quiet resilience. As Maya held the phone high, Maya stood beside her, her gaze unwavering as she met the judge's eyes. "We've had enough," Maya said softly, but her words carried the full weight of their resolve. And in that moment, with one simple phone call, the world seemed to shift. The turning tide. The courtroom, once a theater of ridicule and oppression, had transformed. The quiet tension in the air grew heavier as the weight of Maya and Mia's revelation settled over everyone present. The judge, who had once sat smugly behind his desk, now looked like a trapped animal, his mask of authority slipping with every passing second. The courtroom buzzed with whispered questions, speculations, and the sudden understanding of what had just transpired. Maya's fingers trembled slightly as she lowered her phone, keeping it visible for a moment longer. The glow of the screen seemed to illuminate the space around them, casting shadows on the faces of those who had once judged them so easily. Their eyes, once filled with doubt and disdain, now widened with the realization that this wasn't just another case. This wasn't just about two girls who had been accused of a crime they didn't commit. This was about power, about a system that had failed them, a system they were no longer afraid to challenge. Judge Albright cleared his throat, the sound breaking the silence that had descended like a suffocating fog. He placed his wine glass down with far more care than he had shown moments before. His hands, usually so steady, now trembled as he adjusted his glasses and turned his attention back to the twins. But his previously confident tone was gone, replaced by something darker, more defensive. "Your father," Albright began, his voice cracking slightly. He tried to regain his composure, but there was no mistaking the uncertainty in his tone. "This is an abuse of power." Maya's voice cut him off, sharp and controlled. "You want to talk about abuse of power, Your Honor," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Maybe you should take a closer look at how you've been using your position all these years." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the judge seemed to recoil, as though stunned by her audacity. His face flushed a deep crimson, and his eyes darted around the room, trying to gauge the mood. The crowd, which had once been passive, was now paying close attention. Maya could feel the shift. The balance of power had tilted, and it was no longer in the judge's favor. I don't know what you think you're doing here," Judge Albright stammered, looking more and more like a man backed into a corner. "This is a courtroom. I'm the one in charge here." Mia's lips twisted into a smile that was more bitter than anything else. "You may have the robe, Your Honor, but you don't have the truth," she said, her voice low but full of conviction. "And you certainly don't have our respect." The room was now alive with murmurs. It wasn't just the twins who were making waves. People were beginning to take notice of the glaring inequality in this courtroom. For the first time, the system didn't feel so untouchable. For the first time, it felt like they could actually win. Maya stood tall, her back straight and her shoulders squared. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for fairness," For justice. At that, there was a shift in the room. The judge, who had once leaned on his power like a shield, now seemed fragile. The gavel, which he had banged down so easily moments ago, felt like a distant memory. The reality was clear. Maya and Mia had already started dismantling the narrative he had so carefully constructed. Mia reached out and squeezed her sister's hand, a silent message of support. This was no longer just about them. This was about something bigger. It was about the countless people who had been wrongly accused, the voices that had been silenced by a system that had failed them. And now, they were finally being heard. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened, and a figure entered, one that immediately commanded the room's attention. U.S. Attorney General Richard Carter, Maya and Mia's father, stood tall, his presence filling the space like a powerful wave crashing against the shore. The energy in the room shifted again, this time in their favor. Richard walked slowly, his sharp, authoritative gaze sweeping across the room, assessing the situation in an instant. The tension in the courtroom thickened, the air crackling with the undeniable weight of his position. He didn't need to say a word to be noticed. His mere presence was enough to change the dynamic. Richard didn't glance at the judge immediately. Instead, he took in the room. The hushed whispers, the nervous glances exchanged between the spectators, the quiet disbelief etched on Albright's face. He could feel the undercurrent of unease that ran through the room. Maya and Mia were no longer the only ones fighting for justice. The entire courtroom was now caught in the aftermath of Albright's actions. Without hesitation, Richard approached the bench. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but filled with authority, "I am here to ensure that justice is served, and I believe that starts with a proper investigation into the events that have transpired here today." Judge Albright's face went pale. His eyes darted nervously to the phone still in Maya's hand, the contact name glowing for all to see. Richard Carter, U.S. Attorney General. There was no escaping the truth now. The judge had crossed a line, and it wasn't just a matter of personal bias. It was about a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for far too long. Maya could see the shift in the room as Richard spoke. His words weren't just about defending his daughters. They were about defending the law itself. He wasn't there to fight for a personal vendetta. He was there to remind everyone in the room that the law was meant to protect, not destroy. Richard's voice cut through the tension like a hot knife. "We are here to address not just this case, but the deep-seated biases that continue to permeate our justice system. I will be filing for a full investigation into Judge Albright's conduct, and I will not rest until we've rooted out the corruption that has allowed this behavior to continue." Maya felt her breath catch in her chest. She had known her father's power. She had known that he could make a difference. But hearing him speak, with such unyielding determination, made her feel stronger than ever. This was no longer about her or Mia. This was about everyone who had ever been discriminated against, everyone who had been overlooked or mistreated by those in power. The room was still, the weight of Richard's words pressing down on everyone. For the first time, Judge Albright seemed like a man who was losing control. His smugness had disappeared, replaced by something else. Fear. The courthouse doors opened again, and a team of federal agents stepped in, their presence unmistakable. They moved with purpose, each one scanning the room with sharp eyes. They weren't there to be spectators. They were there to gather evidence. They were there to ensure that no stone was left unturned in the investigation. Maya and Mia stood side by side, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts beating in unison. This wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for everyone who had been treated unfairly. It was a victory for those who had been silenced for too long. The judge didn't speak. He couldn't. Richard had already taken the first steps toward dismantling the system that had allowed Albright to reign unchecked for so many years. The weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. And as the federal agents moved toward him, he knew that his time in power had come to an end. Maya and Mia looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. They had fought for justice, and now finally, It seemed like the system was beginning to listen. But this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to do, and they were ready for it. Justice awakens. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, charged with an energy that had shifted from fear and oppression to something far more formidable: hope. The twins stood side by side, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anxiety and exhilaration. It had begun as a battle for their dignity, a simple plea for justice in the face of an unjust system. But now, the stakes were higher. The courtroom, which had once felt like a suffocating cage, was now the birthplace of something greater, a movement. Richard Carter, the U.S. Attorney General, stood tall beside them, his commanding presence amplifying their strength. His words had sent a clear message. The law would no longer be a tool of oppression for the powerful to wield unchecked. It was meant to protect the innocent, the marginalized, and the voiceless. He was here, not just as a father, but as a man committed to rooting out corruption and ensuring that justice was not just an ideal, but a reality. But as the federal agents moved into the courtroom, the truth of what had just transpired began to sink in. The tide was turning, but there were still many battles left to fight. Richard glanced at his daughters, his face a mixture of pride and concern. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice filled with a determination that matched theirs. "This is just the beginning." The twins nodded, their resolve growing stronger with every passing second. They were no longer just two teenagers caught in the crossfire of a biased system. They were the faces of something much bigger. They were the spark that had ignited a flame of resistance against a system that had long overlooked the injustices faced by people like them. The room had gone quiet, but the tension was palpable. The once confident Judge Albright had been reduced to a shell of himself. The smug smile that had been so prevalent on his face had disappeared, replaced by an almost defeated expression. He was no longer the one in control. The power had shifted, and he knew it. Maya stood still, her hand gripping Nia's tightly. Despite the chaos of the moment, there was a sense of calm that settled over her. For the first time, the twins felt like they were truly being heard. The system that had sought to humiliate them, to break them down, was now facing its own reckoning. "I want an immediate federal investigation into Judge Albright's conduct." Richard's voice rang out once more, sharp and unwavering. "We have enough evidence to move forward with charges of discrimination, abuse of power, and unethical conduct. What happened today, what happened to my daughters, isn't an isolated incident. This court, this judge, has been perpetuating a cycle of systemic injustice for years. And it's time for that to end." The words were bold. The implications were clear. Richard Carter wasn't just fighting for his daughters. He was fighting for every person who had ever been mistreated by a biased system. His words echoed through the courtroom, reverberating in the hearts of those who had silently watched the abuse unfold. But there were still skeptics, and there were still those who clung to their old beliefs, refusing to see the truth for what it was. The federal agents began to work quickly, gathering files, flipping through documents, and preparing to take action. They weren't just there to observe. They were there to ensure that Albright's reign of corruption was over. There would be no more sweeping injustices under the rug. There would be no more hidden biases. The system was being dismantled piece by piece, and it was clear that those who had benefited from it would no longer be able to hide. Maya felt her heart racing as she watched the agents at work. This was real. This was happening. She could hear the soft murmur of conversations from the gallery, whispers of disbelief, of realization. The courtroom had transformed from a place of oppression to a battleground where justice was finally being fought for, not just for them, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. As the investigation began, the twins couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. They had done something that many before them had been too afraid to attempt. They had stood up to a system that was built to keep them down, and they had made a difference. But they knew there was more to be done. Outside the courthouse, the media had already begun to swarm. News vans parked along the street, their cameras trained on the building, capturing every moment. The press had arrived, eager to cover the unfolding story. But this wasn't just about the Carters anymore. This was about a nation finally acknowledging the deep-rooted biases that had long been ignored. As Maya and Mia made their way out of the courthouse, their father walking beside them, they could feel the weight of the eyes that followed them. Some people looked at them with admiration, others with uncertainty. But none of it mattered. They had already changed the narrative. The ride home was quiet, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket. But there was a sense of triumph in the silence, a quiet understanding that they had done something monumental. When they arrived at the house, Richard led them inside, and the three of them stood in the living room, their eyes drawn to the TV where the news anchors were already reporting on the investigation into Judge Albright. The headlines flashed across the screen, detailing the federal probe into judicial misconduct, and for the first time, the twins saw their story not as a tragedy, but as a call to action. Their fight for justice had opened a door that others could now walk through. "I know it's been hard," Richard said, sitting down beside his daughters on the couch. "But we've made a difference, and we're not done yet." Maya and Mia looked at each other, their hands still clasped together. The storm was far from over, but they had already weathered the worst of it. And as they sat together in their living room, the weight of their journey felt lighter. They were no longer fighting just for themselves. They were fighting for a future where no one else would have to face the same injustice they had. In the days that followed, the investigation into Judge Albright continued. News outlets ran continuous coverage, detailing the mounting evidence against him. Federal agents combed through years of case files, uncovering patterns of racial bias in Albright's rulings. Former defendants came forward, sharing their own stories of how the judge had abused his power. And slowly, the cracks in the system began to show. But the twins knew that this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something far bigger than themselves. They had started a movement that would ripple out and inspire others to speak out, to demand change. As the days turned into weeks, the media storm that had once threatened to swallow them whole began to shift. The criticisms and death threats that had filled their inboxes were slowly replaced by messages of support, messages from people who had experienced the same discrimination, the same unjust treatment, and had never had the courage to speak out. People from all over the country were writing to thank them for their bravery, for giving them hope. Maya and Mia realized that this was what it meant to make a difference, to turn a painful experience into something that could change the world. But there was still work to be done. The system had been exposed, but it wasn't enough to just talk about change. They needed to create it. That night, as they sat at the kitchen table with their father, Maya looked at her sister, a quiet fire in her eyes. "We need to take this further," she said. "We can't just stop here. We need to help others who are still facing the same injustices we've been through. We need to make sure this never happens again." Richard nodded, his pride evident in the way he looked at his daughters. "And we will," he said, "one step at a time." But for the first time, Maya and Mia felt like they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. They were ready to make sure that this wasn't just a story of two girls who overcame adversity. It was a story that would inspire generations to come. And the fight for justice was just getting started. The price of standing tall. The morning sun peeked through the heavy curtains of the Carter family living room, casting long shadows across the room. The stillness of the house felt oddly surreal after the storm of activity that had consumed the past few weeks. Maya and Mia sat on the couch, their hands folded neatly in their laps, a quiet weight of responsibility settling in their chests. Their father, Richard, was in his office, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, the air thick with the tension of an ongoing battle. The investigation into Judge Albright's conduct had taken a monumental turn, and now the pressure was mounting, not just on the judge, but on everyone involved. The media frenzy was only growing, and the news reports seemed to change with every passing hour. They were no longer just two teenagers caught in a single incident. They were symbols now, for better or worse, of everything that was wrong with the system. Maya turned to her sister, her eyes filled with a quiet, unspoken concern. They had fought so hard to get to this point, to stand tall and demand the justice they were owed. But the price of standing up was becoming more apparent every day. Mia's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She reached for it absently, her brow furrowing as she read the latest news update. Another protest, Maya said, her voice tinged with frustration. This time, they're calling us the faces of privilege for fighting against Albright. They're trying to discredit everything we've done, Maya. Maya bit her lip, trying to suppress the anger that was bubbling up inside her. They want us to be the villains, she said quietly. But we're not. We never asked for any of this. We just wanted to buy a dress. And now we're fighting for something bigger than us. But they don't see that. Mia nodded, her jaw clenched tightly. No one ever does. They see what they want to see. She let out a sharp breath and ran a hand through her hair. I'm tired of fighting, Maya. I'm tired of being misunderstood. Maya reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. We knew this wouldn't be easy, but we can't back down. We've come this far. We have to keep going. Despite their words, the weight of it all was beginning to settle heavily on their shoulders. The public backlash was relentless. Online trolls, hostile comments, death threats. Everything had escalated, leaving them feeling isolated, even as they stood in the middle of something much bigger than themselves. The media, once enamored with their story, now portrayed them as opportunists who were using their father's influence to gain attention. The constant strain had begun to wear on them, making every day feel like a battle. Friends they once counted on were distancing themselves. Classmates who had cheered them on at track meets now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The teachers who had once been proud of them now seemed hesitant to acknowledge their existence. But Maya and Mia had never been ones to back down. They had been through too much together to let the weight of public opinion tear them apart now. As the twins sat in silence, contemplating the gravity of their situation, Richard stepped into the room, his presence filling the space as it always did. He was tired, his face worn from the endless meetings and the constant pressure of being the U.S. Attorney General, but there was a determination in his eyes that both of his daughters recognized instantly. They had inherited their strength from him, just as they had inherited their resolve. You two have been through hell, Richard said, his voice heavy with both pride and concern. And it's not over. But we're not going to let the media or anyone else rewrite our story. You didn't ask for any of this, but you've done something most people are too afraid to do. You've stood up to the system. And I couldn't be prouder. Maya and Mia exchanged a look. They both understood what he was saying, but the words didn't quite ease the tension they were feeling. What happens next? Maya asked, her voice quiet, as if she were afraid of the answer. Where do we go from here? Richard sat down beside them, his expression serious but not without hope. The investigation into Albright is just the beginning, he said. There will be hearings, public statements, legal battles. We will bring this to the forefront of national attention, and we'll make sure that everyone sees the flaws in the system. But it's going to take time. It's going to be messy. And it's going to hurt. Mia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes never leaving her father's. And what about the people who hate us? She asked, her voice raw with emotion. The ones who think we're just using our father to get ahead. What about them? Richard sighed, the weight of her question clear in his expression. You can't control what people think. You can't control the hate they direct at you, but you can control how you respond. The most important thing you can do is stay true to who you are. No matter how hard it gets, don't let anyone take that from you. The twins sat quietly, absorbing their father's words. It was the same advice he had always given them, to stand tall, to never let the opinions of others dictate their sense of self-worth. But it didn't make the weight of the world they were carrying any lighter. That evening, Richard arranged a private meeting with a group of top civil rights lawyers to discuss the next steps. The meeting was long and intense, filled with legal jargon and strategic talk about how to move forward with the case against Judge Albright. Richard knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge, but about a system that allowed that corruption to thrive. But as he sat across from the legal experts, his thoughts kept drifting back to his daughters. They were too young to be facing this level of scrutiny, this kind of pressure. Yet they were holding their own, stepping up in ways most adults would never dare. They had become symbols of resilience, and in that, they had found strength. But the cost was beginning to show. Late that night, Maya sat at her desk, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop. She had been receiving hundreds of messages, both supportive and hateful, but it was the hateful ones that stung the most. People were questioning her integrity, calling her a spoiled rich girl who was using her father's influence to get ahead. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. How could they when the truth had been buried so deeply beneath layers of prejudice and bias? As she scrolled through the messages, one in particular caught her eye. It was from a person she didn't recognize, someone who claimed to have seen her at the courthouse that day. The message read, "You think you've won, but the truth is, you've just made it worse for everyone. There are others who will never get the chance to have your father bail them out. So good luck pretending this is about justice when it's really about power." Maya's heart clenched, the harsh words sinking deep into her chest. She felt the weight of that message more than any other. It was a reminder of what they were up against, a system that had worked against people like them for so long. She could almost feel the bitter taste of defeat creeping in. But then, she looked across the room at Mia. Her sister was sitting at the window, her gaze distant but resolute. Mia had always been the one to lead with fire, to charge headfirst into any fight. But now, even Maya seemed worn down by the constant battle. Maya walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "We can't stop now," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We've come too far to back down. We have to keep fighting. For us, for everyone." Mia looked at her sister, her expression softening. "I know," she said, her voice steady now. "We've already started something. We can't let them take it away from us." And in that moment, Maya knew. Despite the fatigue, despite the hate, despite the threats, they weren't going to back down. They had started a movement, and they were going to see it through. The fight for justice was far from over, but Maya and Mia were no longer fighting alone. They were fighting for something much bigger than themselves. They were fighting for a future where people like them didn't have to be afraid of the system that was supposed to protect them. The next day, they went to school, their heads held high. The halls were quieter now, the whispers more pronounced, but neither of them flinched. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, that their journey would take them through more storms and uncertainty, but they also knew one thing for sure. They would never stop fighting. This was their moment. This was their fight. And they weren't going to let anyone silence them. The power of unseen allies. The morning after their quiet resolve solidified in the dim light of their bedroom, Maya and Mia walked out of their house with a new sense of purpose. Despite the weight of public scrutiny and the constant swirl of media coverage, they knew their battle was far from over. The investigation into Judge Albright was moving forward, and every step they took was another step closer to changing the system that had tried to break them. They had begun this journey thinking it was just about proving their innocence, but now it was about justice. For them, for every person who had been wronged, and for a society that had grown too comfortable with discrimination. Their school had become a battleground of its own. The whispers in the hallways had grown louder, the stares sharper. Some classmates avoided them completely, as if their mere presence was a reminder of uncomfortable truths. Teachers who had once praised them now treated them with a formality that felt distant and cold. But through it all, Maya and Mia remained steadfast, their shoulders squared as they walked through the crowded hallways, their eyes fixed on a future they were determined to shape. However, it wasn't just the school environment that had become hostile. The outside world, too, was shifting. News outlets were covering the federal investigation with increasing fervor. Judge Albright's past decisions were being scrutinized, his actions exposed for all to see. Yet, with every step forward, new challenges arose. The media coverage had taken a different turn, with much of the focus shifting away from the investigation and onto the twins themselves. Journalists, eager for sensational headlines, began to frame them as the embodiment of a societal rift that was bigger than any one person. They were either seen as powerful icons of resistance or as privileged figures using their father's influence to further their own agendas. The burden of public perception weighed heavily on both of them, but Mia, who had once thrived on the energy of the crowd, now felt like a pawn in a game much larger than she had anticipated. She sat in the cafeteria, scanning the room, noticing the divided groups. Some students still offered tentative smiles, while others seemed to avoid eye contact altogether. It was a stark reminder that standing up for what was right often came with the price of alienation. "This is getting exhausting," Mia muttered under her breath as she stared at the untouched tray of food in front of her. Maya, sitting beside her, gave her a reassuring smile, though her own heart ached with the same weight of isolation. "We'll get through this," Maya said quietly, the words more for herself than her sister. "We've already come this far." Across the room, a group of students gathered around their usual table, laughing and chatting, but there was an emptiness to it now. The twins had been pushed to the edges, their presence no longer welcome in the circles they had once been a part of. As much as they had tried to stand strong, the isolation was starting to sting in ways they hadn't expected. The media coverage continued to paint a divided picture. Headlines, both positive and negative, flashed across their phones, each one a reminder that their story had become a battleground for public opinion. Some praised their bravery, their willingness to fight a corrupt system, while others accused them of exploiting their father's position for personal gain. The comments flooded in, each one more venomous than the last. But amidst the noise, there were also messages of support, ones that Maya and Mia had begun to look for in the sea of criticism. Some came from people they had never met, others from familiar faces in their community. And then, one evening, Maya received a message that would change everything. It was from a former defendant, a man named David Martinez, who had faced Albright's biased rulings in the past. His message was simple but powerful. "I've been waiting for someone to do something about him. You girls are the hope we've needed. Thank you for showing us that standing up to this system is possible." Maya stared at the message for a long time, the weight of its meaning sinking in. They hadn't been alone in their fight. People all over the country had suffered under the same system, and their story had inspired them to speak up. Mia, standing behind her sister, looked over her shoulder and read the message. Her eyes softened as she placed a hand on Maya's shoulder. "We're not just doing this for ourselves, are we?" she said quietly. Maya shook her head, feeling the weight of the realization settle deep within her chest. "No, we're not," she whispered. "This is for all of them, the people who've been ignored, who've been hurt. This is for the people who can't speak for themselves." And in that moment, they both understood the true scale of their mission. The fight for justice wasn't just about them. It was about the countless others who had been silenced by the system. They had become the voice for those who had been overlooked, the ones who had been dismissed because of their race, their class, or their background. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but it also ignited something inside them that they hadn't felt before: purpose. Later that evening, as they sat in the family room, their father entered, looking tired but determined. "I have some news," Richard said, his voice steady but urgent. "We've gotten word that the investigation into Judge Albright is moving forward more swiftly than anticipated. The federal government has begun compiling evidence of his systemic bias, and it's growing stronger by the day. We're starting to see the real cracks in the system." Maya and Mia exchanged a look, their hearts racing. This was it. The tide was turning, and they were right in the center of it. But Richard continued, his expression darkening slightly. "The pushback is going to get worse. You're going to face more media attacks, More public backlash. Some people won't want this to change. They'll try to make you the enemy. Mia clenched her fists, her usual fire returning. Let them try, she said, her voice unwavering. We're not backing down. We're not afraid. Maya nodded in agreement. We've already been through the worst of it. If they think we're going to stop now, they're wrong. Their father's face softened, a flicker of pride in his eyes. I'm proud of you both. I've watched you grow into something more than I ever imagined. But I need you to understand, this is just the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of action. Richard's team of lawyers, in conjunction with federal investigators, began uncovering the full scope of Judge Albright's biased rulings. Court transcripts were examined, evidence was gathered, and more former defendants came forward, recounting their own experiences under Albright's rule. The case grew stronger, and with each new revelation, the pressure on the judge mounted. But the twins weren't content to let the legal process unfold in the shadows. They used their platform to continue speaking out, attending rallies, speaking with activists, and encouraging others to share their stories. They knew the power of their voices, and they weren't about to waste it. As the investigation continued, more people started to rally behind them, some in small ways, others with great acts of defiance. The first major victory came when a local civil rights organization reached out, offering to partner with them to create a national initiative to combat racial profiling in the justice system. It was a dream that had been growing in the back of Maya and Mia's minds for weeks, and now, with this new support, it was beginning to take shape. I know it's hard, Richard said one night as they sat down to discuss their next steps. But every time you speak, every time you stand up, you're giving others the courage to do the same. You're creating a ripple effect, one that will last long after this case is over. Maya smiled, her heart swelling with pride and determination. She looked at Mia, her sister's eyes burning with the same resolve, and knew that they were far from done. They were on the brink of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. This fight, this movement, was theirs to lead. They had already made a mark. But now, they would make sure that the mark they left on the world would be one that could never be erased.